If I told you that the most profitable product in human history isn't oil, or gold, or technology, but debt, would you believe me? Debt is older than money, older than coins, banks, or credit cards. It began as a promise carved into clay. In ancient Mesopotamia, more than 4,000 years ago, the first cities were already running on credit. Merchants lent grain and silver to farmers, who repaid after harvest. The earliest ledgers weren't written on paper, they were baked into clay tablets, recording who owed what and when. But those simple records became something much bigger. Rulers realized that debt wasn't just an agreement between two people. It was a tool of power. When farmers couldn't repay, they lost their land. When entire villages fell into arrears, they became laborers for the temple or the crown. Debt became a mechanism for turning free citizens into servants. And the problem became so severe that some of the earliest laws in history, like the Code of Hammurabi, included clauses to cancel debts in times of crisis. Kings issued periodic debt jubilees to prevent total social collapse. Even then, they understood the danger. Unchecked debt doesn't just destroy lives, it destroys societies. But over time, the logic of debt grew more sophisticated and more profitable. In the ancient world, debt was personal. By the Renaissance, it became institutional. And by the modern age, it became the most lucrative product ever invented. Because unlike oil, gold, or land, debt has no limits. You can create it out of nothing and charge interest forever. The next great leap in debt's evolution came from the merchants and bankers of medieval Europe in the 14th century. The Medici family in Florence pioneered double-entry bookkeeping, a method to track both credit and debt across complex transactions. This simple innovation allowed empires to rise. Kings discovered they could finance wars not through taxes, which caused rebellion, but through loans, which created loyalty. Bankers lent to monarchs. Monarchs granted charters, monopolies, and political favors in return. Debt became the bloodstream of empire. By the 1600s, this system had matured into something entirely new. In 1602, the Dutch East India Company issued the world spurs tradable bonds and shares, creating a permanent market for debt. Investors could buy and sell obligations like they were commodities. For the first time, debt became liquid, something you could trade, speculate on, and profit from endlessly. The city of Amsterdam became the financial capital of the world. Its canals were built on credit, its fleets were funded by bonds. The empire's reach from Java to South Africa was underwritten by the promise of repayment. But the real breakthrough came in 1694, when England created the Bank of England. Desperate for funds to fight France, the British Crown borrowed £1.2 million from private investors. In return, those investors were granted the right to issue notes debt backed by that loan. That single act changed money forever. For the first time, money itself was debt. The paper in your hand wasn't tea, a representation of gold or silver. It was a claim on future taxation, future production, and future labor. Debt had become the foundation of the entire economy, and it worked beautifully, at least for those at the top. Every war Britain fought in the 18th and 19th centuries, from the Napoleonic wars to colonial expansion, was financed by debt. Bondholders grew rich, bankers became powerful, the government grew stronger, the people, meanwhile, paid the interest through taxes, through inflation, through the quiet erosion of their purchasing power. Debt allowed governments to spend beyond their means. It allowed wars to last longer than resources justified. It created the illusion of prosperity while pushing the cost into the future. And it became so profitable that no empire could live without it. By the 20th century, debt was no longer just a tool of kings or companies. It became the lifeblood of everyday life. After World War II, Western nations embraced a new ideology: growth at any cost. Factories, highways, suburbs, universities, all financed by borrowing, The United States perfected the system. The Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944 tied global currencies to the dollar and the dollar to gold. It was supposed to ensure stability, but in reality, it gave America the greatest privilege in financial history: the ability to print the world's reserve currency. When Nixon ended the gold standard in 1971, money became pure debt. Every dollar in circulation was created by someone borrowing it and promising to pay it back with interest. The modern debt machine was complete. Banks discovered they didn't need deposits to lend money. They could simply create new credit on their balance sheets. Governments discovered that deficits no longer mattered. Corporations learned they could leverage debt to inflate their value. And consumers were told that credit was freedom. Credit cards, mortgages, student loans, the new trinity of modern dependence. Debt was no longer a burden. It was marketed as opportunity. Buy now, pay later. Live beyond your means. The future can wait. But the math was merciless. Because every dollar of debt requires interest, and interest compounds faster than wages grow. As debt multiplied, so did inequality. The financial industry became an economy within an economy, making profits not by producing goods, but by creating, trading, and insuring debt itself. By the 1980s, Wall Street had turned debt into a full-blown industry. Junk bonds, leverage buyouts, credit default swaps, each new instrument more complex and more detached from reality. And as long as the system kept expanding, no one asked where the money came from. Because the answer was simple. From the future? By the late 20th century, debt had become not just a national tool, but a global one. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank, created after World War II to stabilize economies, became instruments of influence. They offered loans to developing nations with strings attached. In exchange for assistance, countries were required to adopt austerity measures, privatize public assets, and open markets to foreign capital. On paper, it was modernization. In practice, it was control. By the 1980s, dozens of nations in Africa, Latin America, and Asia found themselves trapped in a cycle of dependency. They borrowed to develop, but interest payments consumed their budgets. Public services collapsed. Local industries were dismantled. The debt was never meant to be repaid. It was meant to be permanent. Debt became the new colonialism. Instead of armies, there were bankers. Instead of weapons, contracts, and every repayment flowed upward from the poorest to the richest, from the periphery to the core, from the many to the few. At the same time, a new kind of empire was being built not on land or industry, but on consumption. In the 1950s and 60s, post-war prosperity in the West created the middle class. But to sustain that prosperity, people needed to keep buying houses, cars, appliances, education, vacations. The only way to maintain that level of consumption was with credit, and so the modern consumer credit system was born. Banks realized something profound. An indebted population is an obedient one. A person with no debt can walk away. A person with a mortgage, a car loan, and student debt cannot. Debt keeps you tied to the system. It keeps you working, paying, consuming, believing that freedom lies just one more paycheck away. Advertising, education, and politics all aligned around this idea. Spend to show your worth. Borrow to achieve your dreams. Debt became moralized, a sign of responsibility, adulthood, even patriotism. By the early 2000s, debt had become so normalized that an entire generation was born into it. Student loans replaced public funding for education. Credit cards replaced savings. Mortgages ballooned as housing prices soared beyond reach when the 2008 crisis hit. The truth was exposed. The entire global economy was one enormous pyramid of debt. Banks lent money they didn't have to people who couldn't pay it back, then sold those debts as assets to investors. When it all collapsed, governments stepped in not to rescue the people, but to rescue the system. Trillions were printed, The debts were socialized, the profits remained private, and once again, the world was rebuilt on the same foundation: more debt. So what makes debt the most profitable product in history? Simple. It never expires. Oil is burned, gold is hoarded, technology becomes obsolete, but debt regenerates. Every payment creates a new opportunity to lend. Every crisis creates a reason to borrow more. Debt feeds on time itself, on your future labor, your children's taxes, your nation's promises, and as long as people believe that debt equals wealth, the system endures. Governments borrow to spend, corporations borrow to expand, consumers borrow to survive. The debt doesn't have to be repaid, it just has to grow. That's why central banks panic at the thought of deflation, because deflation means the debt machine stops. If prices fall, if people save, if credit contracts, the illusion collapses. The modern economy doesn't run on money, it runs on confidence. The belief that tomorrow's debt will pay for today's promises. But confidence is fragile, and when it breaks, the whole structure shakes. Every financial crisis, every market panic, every currency collapse, it has the same tremor, a reminder that infinite debt cannot sustain a finite world. To understand debt is to understand modern slavery, not through chains, but through contracts. Your freedom, your home, your education, your taxes, all are shaped by the logic of credit, but awareness is power. Once you see how the system works, you begin to see your choices differently. A mortgage is not just a home loan, it has a decades-long claim on your future labor. A credit card is not just convenience, it's a high-interest lease on your income. A national deficit is not just policy, it is a transfer of your purchasing power to bondholders. And yet, debt is not inherently evil. It is a tool, neutral, powerful, and dangerous. Used wisely, it can build civilizations. Used recklessly, it can destroy them. The danger lies in forgetting who benefits from its existence. Because the real profits of debt Danti come from helping the Barawa. They come from owning the obligation. Every interest payment, every penalty, every rollover, each one is a stream of income for someone else. The system doesn't just sell you goods, it sells your future. And as long as you keep buying, the machine keeps running. The world today is more indebted than ever before. Global debt has surpassed $300 trillion, more than 3 times the size of the entire global economy. Governments owe, corporations owe, households owe, and yet the machine demands more. Central banks keep interest rates low to encourage borrowing. Politicians promise new spending to keep voters happy. Consumers take on credit to maintain lifestyles their wages can't support. We live in an economy addicted to leverage, but addiction always ends in collapse or transformation. At some point, the numbers become unsustainable. Debt stops being an asset and becomes a liability. The question is not if the system changes, but how. Will it end in inflation as governments print their way out? Will it end in default as nations refuse to pay? Or will it evolve into a digital debt system where every transaction is tracked, scored, and controlled? History suggests one truth: no empire, no system, no economy can expand forever. Every era of credit eventually meets its reckoning. When that moment comes, those who understand value, real value, will endure. Because true wealth doesn't come from borrowing, it comes from producing. From skills that can't be outsourced, from assets that can't be inflated away, from communities that trade trust instead of debt. The future doesn't belong to those who owe, it belongs to those who understand. Debt built the modern world, but it also hides its greatest weakness: dependency. And when enough people wake up to that truth, the balance of power shifts, because the system only works as long as you believe you need it. Debt isn't just a contract. Ever created. It turns your time, your work, and your future into income for someone else. Understanding that truth is the first step to financial freedom, and once you see it, you can never unsee it.